Okay, well, hopefully that stream's working now. Let me know in the comments if you can hear me or see me all right. I haven't got it set up at the moment where I can see the comments as they come in, unfortunately, so there's always a bit of lag, but I would appreciate it anyway, even if it's after the fact. Well, welcome. If you don't know me, I'm the host of the Conflict Skills podcast. I'm a professional mediator, and I've put together a series of streams this week, really looking at analyzing conflict situations. I've decided to focus on workplace conflict and just put together a number of different case studies that might help me to demonstrate the frameworks and approaches that I use as a mediator, but also the kind of things that I include when I'm delivering training in conflict resolution skills. I know not every organization has a budget for training and professional development, so frankly, I just wanted to develop these in case they were useful for some people who might be watching down the track. So today I'm going to focus on a quote, a quick reflection from Robert Greene that really resonates with me. I'll explain the conflict resolution scenario that we'll be focusing on today, which is an engineer that's a junior engineer joined the team, a very large 300 plus organization, and they're having some challenges with someone who they're working alongside of. I'll talk about some of the frameworks that I've mentioned earlier in the week as well, the 5 types of conflict, but particularly the 5 different conflict modes, and then just maybe explore some of the different options that the person in this scenario might consider. Now, I'm doing this without notes. I'm reading the scenario like I've read it before as I was getting the slides and stuff together, but I haven't spent a great deal of time reflecting on it. And that's by design. I want you to see how I would think about just a new situation that I'm not particularly familiar with. And even if you're not dealing with engineers or you're dealing with a different kind of conflict in your workplace, my hope is that you'll be able to take some of these different ways of thinking and apply them to the different areas that you're dealing with, the different challenges that you're facing. So I've got a quote from Robert Greene again, but it's a different book to yesterday. I've got it down, I can't reach it properly, but it's The Daily Laws is the name of the book. Every single day of the year, 365 days a year, you've got a little quote from one of his other books and then a bit of reflection. And I just love that format. Like it's a single page each day. It only takes you a minute or two to read, and gosh, it can be useful. So this is the quote. We humans tend to live in the moment, but we're not merely animals tied to the present. Human reality encompasses the past. Every event is connected to something that happened before in an endless chain of historical causation. Any present problem has deep roots in the past. How does that resonate with you? I showed this slide yesterday. It's kind of explaining the way that I think about conflict as I become involved. Sometimes I'm just coaching one of the people that's dealing with the conflict. Sometimes it's both of them. And almost inevitably, people oversimplify what's going on when we think about conflict. They're doing this because of this. They thought this, but they should understand this. They're wrong about this. I told them so. They should have listened to me, blah, blah, blah. It's funny, like, I don't know if you've heard that phrase, the fog of war, but I remember hearing Douglas Murray talk about this on the Joe Rogan podcast a while ago, that in the present moment, especially when we're dealing with conflict, it's like we're surrounded by this quite confusing fog. We don't know which option is going to work best to deal with a particular issue until we've tried it. And when we look back, we can see, oh, that was a mistake. I should have done this instead of this. But we can't see the fog. Like we can't see the fog that was existing all around us during those challenging moments that we're in. And particularly when we think about other people's behavior, we really oversimplify their motivations and their intentions. We tend to prescribe them 100% ownership. We assume they have full control over their behavior, which of course isn't necessarily true. And then also we deal with like the flow-on effects, the build-up of that misunderstanding. I assume that I know what you meant, so I act in a particular way. I might react, so to speak, and then you react to me, and around we go. But of course, it's not just the two people involved in the conflict. It's also the different contexts that both of them are facing, the other people in their lives, the way that they were brought up, their parents, early career experiences that they might have had dealing with a real a-hole manager or being left to sink or swim or being given a really good, supportive, nurturing environment. Like whatever our background is, it influences the way that we perceive and interpret the current situation. So it's a real mistake, I think, that people can sometimes make to assume that they get it, assume that they've got all of the facts and they've got all of the answers. And I wanted to talk about this for a few moments before we get into the case study today, because No offense to any engineers that might be watching, but I think that engineering kind of personality often approaches things like this. It's like, what's the problem? Let's get the facts. Let's develop a set of options. Let's come up with some criteria, and then let's implement, and then let's revise and tweak and measure, etc., as best we can. So they do approach it in this very fact-based kind of way. But when we think about something like relationships, there's no quantitative metric that we can use to properly understand it. In fact, I think if we can just pause and reflect and think, what are we feeling at the moment? Like, which bits of this feels yucky or stressful, or which bits of this am I feeling a bit bent out of shape about or worked up about? That can often give us insight as to our boundaries, what might be going on in terms of our own internal processes and the way that we're perceiving the current situation. So let's have a look at the case study. I've got it on a couple of slides because it's reasonably long. And then I'll sort of share some of my initial thoughts looking at the types of conflict, but then also considering those different conflict modes. I just have a sip of coffee before I do that. And if you want to have a drink as well, feel free to have a break. So I'll read the case study and then talk about some initial thoughts. Pull it up on the screen there. As a junior engineer of a 5-engineer team, I've gained 4 or 5 years of experience and am now in my second year at the current company. This is my first time working in a large organisation with around 300 people. I've been feeling unheard and ignored. This has happened when I've advocated for my learning and development, reevaluated our time estimation process, or discussed ideas in meetings or through Slack. It's interesting, isn't it? Like, I feel heard and ignored. So the emotions sitting there to some extent maybe is the tip of the iceberg, but underneath it, there's some kind of a clash of expectation. When I think about what conflict actually is, I think that's not a bad way of defining it. It's this meeting of different expectations. I think this would work better and you think something else. I think this should happen and you've got a different idea in your head. And that might be what's going on here. So when the person feels unheard or ignored, I suppose the thing that jumps out to me is compared to what? Like, what do you mean you feel unheard? That doesn't really mean anything. What are the things that have happened that have led you to that place? What would you have liked who to do what differently so that this could have been avoided? It's like we can sometimes think about this in something of a causal sequence, but we don't want to make the mistake of assuming that it's all because of the way that we've been treated, like the way that this person's feeling and being heard and ignored. Well, that depends on the way that they interpret the current situation and what they expect. If I think that it's my job just to listen to my boss and do what they tell me, it's kind of impossible for me to feel unheard. Like, it's not really my boss's job to hear me. So what's the hearing that this person would be looking for? That might be something that I would consider asking them in a coaching conversation. What would make the biggest difference for you? If they could do something differently, what would that be? And how would you feel differently then as a result? So the person who's writing the scenario goes on to say, I addressed this with my manager and we added a week to my project and implemented a time tracking spreadsheet. Yesterday, my team lead reviewed my recent PR in a dismissive manner. I had encountered a blocker and implemented a solution, but her critique upset me. She claimed she didn't understand my meaning and then repeated the same mistake, which resulted in the same blocker. It's interesting, isn't it? Like, this cause of misunderstanding. It says that dismissed me, but at the same time claimed she didn't understand my meaning. So which one is it there? They're potentially a little bit different. And the person writing this scenario, I think, is just suggesting that it's the team leader's fault. But me, as coaching them, I might ask them something like, how did you respond? How did you react in the moment? Like, what did you say? How would you have looked? What was your facial expression at the time? What was the vibe in the room? Was there a sense of things were heating up and there was a bit of tension? What happened before that? How did the meeting begin? I think that often influences the way that these kind of conversations play out as well. They say we've had similar disagreements before and she ended up ghosting me for several days. After reaching out to her multiple times yesterday, the same thing happened. So I decided to elaborate on my perspective and feelings. Interesting. You've had the experience that the other person's not responsive to your feelings, so you think that the solution is dialing up the volume. Well, that'll be interesting to see how that one plays out, won't it? I initially thought it was a misunderstanding, which she confirmed earlier today, but didn't acknowledge my upset about her behaviour. Okay, so she's confirmed that there was a misunderstanding, but didn't acknowledge my upset about her behavior. What do you think is going on here? Have you been in a situation like this where you felt like this? Or maybe you've had one of your team come to look for your support when they're dealing with this. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I wanted to discuss it in our next one-on-one to avoid further misunderstandings, but she didn't respond. I'm laughing because to me, I can very much imagine meeting the other person who he's talking about and them thinking, I'm just so sick of the way that they're always dramatic. Everything needs to be a big deal. Why can't we just focus on our job, come to work, do the work and go home kind of thing? Why does everything need to be a massive issue? But then the other person's thinking, you're not listening to me. You're not taking it seriously. They say that the situation distracted me from work, so I spoke to my manager who gets along with both of us. Hold on. So the problem that was there was that you were distracted from work. Was there anything that you could have been able to do to concentrate again on your work? But you've brought it up with your manager, like skipped the person that you're in the conflict with and instead brought in a senior person with authority, etc., which of course elevates the stakes. And it says he'll mediate by contacting her and we might discuss it later. How are they going to mediate just by contacting the other person, like what, passing on their concerns? They think that you're not listening to them or something. Like, why wouldn't you go and talk to the person about this in the first instance? I'm not sure about this one. And then here's the final paragraph here, and I think this often explains some of the underlying patterns that we might have observed. I know I can be overly invested in work and take things personally, but this is a difficult situation. I've committed to finding a new job next year, but I still need to manage my current workplace and avoid similar issues elsewhere. I'm open to perspectives on this. I mean, what do you make of that? What jumps out at you about all of those things that the person's written? They're upset because the person misunderstood them and then the other person had to hide not to acknowledge their upset. I mean, it's a really interesting area because we've all got a subjective interpretation of what appropriate support from our manager looks like. And it's very likely that at times we're going to have a different expectation to the people that we're dealing with. And if this person that he's talking about isn't necessarily his manager, maybe it's like a senior engineer within the team, so he doesn't have to report to them, but they've kind of got this structural senior level. Well, I'm not sure about skipping them and going to talk to your manager and bringing them in, how that's going to necessarily help. In my experience, even sometimes being brought in as an external mediator, like the downside is that it increases the stakes. It makes people feel like there's more pressure. It maybe increases the sense of other people watching and having insight into what's going on, which might make people a bit more defensive, etc. It introduces a number of different complications. So let's think about some of those different tools that I talked about earlier in the week and how we could apply them here. So for me, I often consider just pausing and thinking, well, what's important here as a way of prioritizing? And then that helps me to evaluate the options that I've got. So the first thing is goals for yourself. Like what's important to you right now, as well as work? What else is going on outside of your work? Are you just about to get married or you're going through a divorce or a separation? Maybe your parents are sick at the moment and you need to care for them. Maybe you've just moved internationally, so you're still in the process of getting some stability and you're not necessarily sure whether or not you'll live where you're going to live at the moment for more than a year or two. Like there's so many of these moving pieces in our life outside of work that affect what we should want from work. And yet when it comes to career or your business or whatever else it might be, like we tend to really compartmentalize and put it in its box. This is my goal for the business. But in my experience, that tends to be much more helpful thinking about that in the broader context. Certainly as a business owner and entrepreneur myself, it's very stressful. So it can be helpful thinking about how much time you want to spend, how much appetite you've got for dealing with stress or change or disruption or all-nighters or whatever the thing is. That'll fluctuate and change over time. So this person says that they've already decided that they're going to apply for other jobs. So if I was meeting them before a mediation, I might say to them then, okay, well, fair enough, I get where you're coming from. So then what should be the priority for the next 6 months within the team? Like obviously you'd like longer term for the person to understand where you're coming from. It sounds like for you, it's important that you feel like a valuable team member and that you've got something to contribute. And for you, it comes across as really dismissive when the other person's not interested in listening to that. At the same time, given that you're going to leave anyway, I would say to them, what are the chances that you're going to run into these people after that? Oh, probably not good. Okay. So, what difference would it make to you in 5 years if right now the person could understand you or they couldn't? Would it make any difference? Probably not. Is this something that you can tolerate, at least in the short term, even if it's not ideal, potentially? Is there some low hanging fruit or real priorities in terms of the way that you're being treated? Maybe there's a good enough kind of middle ground that you could accept. They're still a bit rude to me, but at the end of the day, it's not such a big deal. I've got a few people that I'm friends with and mates with at work, so I've got some connection there. And this person's not responsible for my performance management processes or anything. So maybe I can just let some of that stuff go. So, where are the things that you need to hold on to, those priorities, and what are the areas that maybe it feels intense in the moment, but in hindsight or upon reflection, you could let some of that go through to the keeper? What's your goal for the relationship with your boss? Do you want them to be a reference or something like that? Do you want to still be friends with the people that you work with after you leave? Maybe you want to be seen as supportive. You want to look after the junior members of the team or something and protect them from this same toxic behavior. Like in every context that we're in, going to have different priorities and different goals that resonate with us and work for us. But in the moment, it's very difficult to get clarity around those. And then finally, what are your goal for others? Like, are there other people that you want to support? Your children at the moment, do you want to be there for them, your wife, or whoever else it might be? Even like if you've got members of your team and you're thinking about leaving, what kind of a foundation do you want to set up so that you're not left, so that they're not left completely drifting at sea when you leave without any support, etc. So there's no right and wrong here, but it can be helpful just to think about these different areas. And I find it much more helpful to write them down rather than just pause and think. Even getting a pen and paper out, I think, is better than using your phone or using your keyboard as well. Slows down our thinking, it encourages us to externalize. And often when we see something written down in our own handwriting, it changes the way that we think and feel about it. So we could also consider these 5 types of conflict. I talked about this tool in the stream a couple of days ago. This is 5 different elements that might be contributing to any conflict situation that we're dealing with. And pulling it apart using this framework means that we can develop a number of different options for dealing with the issue. For example, there's some elements of data conflict that are sitting here, isn't it? When he says that he tried to give some feedback to that senior engineer on the team and they misunderstood him and he felt then dismissed. Well, what needed to happen for her to understand you? What was the information that they didn't understand and how was that communicated to them? What options are there for clarification? So we need to tread a little bit carefully. We don't want to come in and say, what are you, an idiot? What are you, a jerk? Are you even taking this seriously? Like, we don't want to give the impression that we think that they're not trying or that we think that they're not capable. But we want to say, look, it sounds like we've got different takes on this. This is the way that I would normally talk about this section of the code. Does that make any sense to you? Or have you got a different way that you would normally communicate about that? So I'm saying, look, we're going to have different perspectives here. Let's see what we can do to get on the same page moving forward. We could talk about interests. Like maybe there's something that he could offer this senior person, like I'll help you out with this, or let me do a bit of extra research on this that would make your life easier. And it could be like an if you, then I. If you can do this for me, then this is what I'd be happy to, this is what I'm prepared to do for you. This is what I can do for you. In order for me to do that, I need you to help me out with this, or I need this to change, or I need this to be different. So we could think then about structural conflict, I suppose, like maybe more time in those kind of meetings would allow the confusion to be explored and clarified. Maybe there is an option to send information before the meeting. So he could have emailed that person just an executive summary or a cheat sheet, reference sheet, or whatever kinds of ways of explaining it would have helped to reduce that confusion. So giving it in written form, printing out notes that you can bring along with you, sending an email afterwards, just explaining some of the more ambiguous sections of the conversation that you went through. These are all options for changing the structure, and they can also work too. Then we could deal with the conflict in terms of values. Like, it doesn't feel to me like you're taking it seriously, but I'm wondering if you've got a different way of understanding all of this. Like, maybe to you, all dealing with all of this emotional kind of stuff is largely irrelevant. We should just focus on the code itself. At the same time, some of the earlier experiences and managers that I've worked with previously really had a focus on developing good communication within the team to lay the foundation then that we could solve some of these problems. But I don't know, I don't want to make assumptions or rush in thinking that I've got all the answers or anything. What do you make of it at the moment? Like, how are you viewing things within the team or communication with me? And is there anything that I could do differently that might help? So I'm saying to her, look, we've got different ideas of right and wrong, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. instead of saying, you've dismissed me, you're not taking this seriously, or why won't you get back to me? I could normalize that and say, look, I'm wondering if maybe we've got different interpretations that's going on here. So I might be looking for something from you that you're not actually even aware of, let alone prepared to agree to or to give. Or we could focus on the relationship, like take them out for a coffee, see if you can sit next to them at the next team lunch, just do a little bit of rapport building. Maybe there's something that you can do to help them. You might let them have a vent if they're sitting there stewing and upset about something. But all of those options are probably not going to have much long-term impact if underneath it there's the issue with the data or the structure or those underlying values or to some extent the interests. It's like if they're not compelled and not really benefiting from doing the thing that you're looking for them to do, well, what are the chances that they're actually going to follow through with it? And then finally, we could consider those conflict modes. Within all of the conflict that's going on for this engineer who wrote the case study, they've got different options for responding, and they don't necessarily all have to be consistent. There might be some elements of these conversations or these kinds of meetings where they could just take an accommodating kind of approach. Go with the flow, no worries, I'm happy to do that. And you're thinking in your head, I don't have to do that, that's not my job. But there might be some situations where it just makes sense. There would be other situations, though, where it makes sense to take more of a competing, directing kind of approach. No, that's not something that I'm prepared to agree to. That's not something that we could organize. That's not something that would work. Here are my concerns. Here's my reasons why. Here's what I am prepared to do, etc. So within those, of course, we could compromise. This is the meet in the middle kind of win-win options that we might be able to come up with. Look, could we at least spend 15 minutes talking about this before we get onto the business arising kind of issues down the track? Like, I know you don't want to spend hours talking about it. Could we have a quick chat? I know that for you, a mediation or something like that's not going to make sense. We're flat out at the moment. Could we at least organize a time to maybe grab a coffee or something and talk it through? I'd be keen to hear your perspective on all of this. There would be a lot of options, I think, where this person could avoid the conflict, just let it go. I suppose we don't necessarily need to take all of these things as seriously. And they wrote at the end of their case study, didn't they? I know that I can be overly invested, and I know that I tend to take things personally. And so that would be a question that they might benefit from considering too. What would be the long-term impact of just letting some of this go? Like, it feels frustrating in the short term. I feel like I'm not being appreciated or acknowledged or whatever. But how about long-term? Is that likely to lead to a practical impact on your career or something similar? And then finally, we could consider the options for collaborating. So to me, this sounds like what the person's doing. They're saying, look, we should talk about this. We should figure out what's happening here. We don't want this problem to keep recurring. But then on the other hand, the other person's saying, look, that's not something that's important to me, or that's not something that I'm prepared to do through their behavior. So that would be the question. Which of those is it? Is it that they don't think it's important, or is it that they're aware of an issue and they don't think that this is the best way to resolve it? So if we wanted to take that collaborating kind of approach, it would be saying to them something like, could we organize a time to discuss? Could we organize a time to talk it through, etc.? This is what I've noticed from my perspective. What's your take on it all? How do we want things to be within the team moving forward? And then what kind of options would help us to get there? Now, you might not have this as an explicit conversation, like using those terms and those words, but it might be saying something like, look, I really appreciated the way that you did that last week. I can remember a few months ago, that was the kind of thing that would have caused us to get really stuck. How did that come across to you when I sent you that email at last minute? Like, did that seem overly pushy or anything? Certainly not my intention. I wanted to just let you know what the situation is as soon as possible, but how did that resonate with you? So I'm kind of saying, look, you're not necessarily interpreting my communication in the way that I intend it, of course, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't figure out a way to communicate moving forward. But how does that resonate with you, thinking about the different conflict modes or the underlying types of conflict, or maybe even considering that dynamic interaction that goes on between people? I'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in feedback, suggestions for my podcast or these streams, you can shoot me an email. It's podcast@simongood.com. And if you would like to go that level deeper in terms of your knowledge and skills and confidence dealing with workplace conflict, I have a self-paced course on my website, The Essential Foundations for Managing Workplace Conflict. So that's really an overview of a lot of these different practical frameworks and spending a bit more time explaining them and then talking about how they can then be used in practice. If that's something that's useful for you, you can check out my website, simongood.com. But otherwise, thanks very much for watching. I'm enjoying these streams so far. Let me know if you've got ideas for other topics, if you've got a situation that you'd like me to consider using as a case study, or maybe a question about something that I've said. Love to hear from you. So send a comment below or podcast@simongood.com. Thanks. Have a great day.